Walter Hayes wasn't supposed to be thinking about trains anymore. That was the entire point of retirement. Yet, on a gray October morning, he found himself standing outside the North River Freight Terminal, holding a folded pension form in one hand and staring through a chain-link fence at locomotives he no longer had any reason to study. The wind carried the familiar scent of diesel exhaust and damp steel. For a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. Forklifts moved between stacks of shipping containers. Workers in reflective vests crossed service roads. Somewhere in the distance, a locomotive horn echoed across the industrial valley. The place had changed. The sounds hadn't. Walter adjusted the collar of his worn jacket and checked his watch. The pension office was running behind schedule, again. He sighed and settled onto a metal bench near the administration building. At 71, waiting had become a larger part of life than he cared to admit. Waiting at doctors' offices, waiting for phone calls, waiting for repairs, waiting for days to pass. Across the yard, a long freight train began rolling slowly toward one of the newer tracks. Walter watched without intending to. Old habits. The locomotive at the front gleamed beneath the overcast sky. Fresh paint, updated systems, new generation equipment. Machines that practically diagnosed themselves. At least that was what the brochures claimed. A mechanic standing nearby glanced at the locomotive and then returned to his tablet screen. Nobody seemed particularly interested. Walter looked away, then looked back. Something tugged at the edge of his attention. Not a sight, a sound. He frowned. The train continued moving. Steel wheels rolled against steel rail. Air compressors cycled. Electric fans hummed. Hundreds of ordinary mechanical noises blended together. Yet beneath them was something else. A faint metallic pulse. Tiny, almost invisible to the ear. Tick, tick, tick. Then gone. Walter straightened slightly. The locomotive continued around a shallow curve. The strange sound disappeared completely. He waited. Nothing. Maybe he'd imagined it. The years had a way of making a man question himself, especially when that man had spent 4 decades listening for problems most people never noticed. The train continued down the line. Walter was about to dismiss the feeling when another locomotive approached the same curve. Again he listened. Normal wheel noise, normal vibration, nothing unusual. His eyes narrowed. Interesting. A few minutes later, the first locomotive returned from a switching maneuver. As it entered the curve once more, tick, 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 gone. Walter's stomach tightened. Not fear, recognition. The kind that arrived before understanding. He stood, without fully realizing why. The mechanic with the tablet noticed him approaching. "You need something, sir?" Walter nodded toward the locomotive. "That unit." The mechanic glanced over his shoulder. "What about it?" Walter hesitated. The answer sounded ridiculous even to him. "I think there's a problem." The younger man blinked. "What kind of problem?" "I don't know yet." The mechanic laughed politely. "Well, diagnostics are clean." "I'm sure they are." The mechanic folded his arms. Walter could already see the expression forming. The same one he'd encountered countless times near the end of his career. Respect mixed with skepticism. The look people gave when they thought experience had become nostalgia. "Sir, that locomotive was inspected 3 days ago." Walter nodded. "I'm aware. And it's one of the newest units we've got." Walter continued watching the tracks. "Could still have a problem." The mechanic smiled patiently. "Based on what?" Walter listened for a moment before answering. "A sound." The mechanic stared. "A sound." "Yes." "What kind of sound?" Walter rubbed his jaw. That was the difficult part, explaining a lifetime of experience to someone who hadn't lived it. "It only happens entering the curve." The mechanic looked unconvinced. "Maybe wheel flange contact." "No." "You sure?" Walter nodded. "Too rhythmic." The mechanic sighed. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but if diagnostics don't show anything, they don't hear everything." The response came more sharply than Walter intended. An awkward silence followed. The mechanic shifted his weight. Walter immediately regretted his tone. The young man wasn't being disrespectful, just practical. The world worked differently now. Computers checked temperatures, vibrations, pressures, and tolerances faster than any human ever could. Most days, they were probably right. Most days. "Sorry," Walter said quietly. The mechanic softened. "No offense taken." For a moment, neither spoke. The locomotive disappeared beyond a row of containers. Walter watched the empty track. The feeling remained, persistent, uncomfortable, like a word he couldn't quite remember. "How long did you work rail?" the mechanic asked. 42 years. The young man's eyebrows lifted. "As an engineer?" Walter nodded. "Started as a brakeman." "That's a long time." "It goes fast." The mechanic looked back toward the tracks. "My grandfather worked freight." Walter smiled faintly. "Then he probably spent half his life being cold." That earned a small laugh. The tension eased, but not the feeling in Walter's chest. The locomotive returned again. Same curve, same speed. Tick, tick, tick. Gone, there again. Walter felt every muscle in his back tighten. The mechanic noticed nothing, or perhaps heard nothing unusual. The sound was simply too small, too brief, too buried beneath everything else. Yet Walter couldn't ignore it, because he knew something about railroads that many people didn't. Catastrophes rarely announced themselves loudly. Most began as details. Tiny details. A vibration, a crack, a hesitation, a sound. Things so minor they were easy to dismiss, until they weren't. His pension appointment was finally called over the loudspeaker. "Mr. Hayes?" Walter turned. A receptionist stood near the building entrance. "We're ready for you." He looked back at the tracks one last time. The locomotive was already moving away. The mechanic raised a hand. "Take care, Mr. Hayes." "You too." Walter headed toward the office. Yet throughout the entire appointment, he struggled to focus. Numbers blurred together. Forms passed across the desk. Questions were asked. Answers were given. But his thoughts remained outside, following that locomotive, listening. By the time he left, the afternoon sky had darkened. A light drizzle had begun falling. Most workers were preparing for shift changes. Walter paused beside the parking lot, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He removed a small notebook, the same notebook he carried almost every day. The cover was worn smooth from years of use. He opened it, looked toward the rail yard, and wrote down the locomotive identification number he had memorized earlier, NRX 7148. The ink lingered on the page. For several seconds he stared at it, feeling slightly foolish. A retired engineer chasing a noise. Nothing more. Probably. He slipped the notebook back into his pocket and climbed into his truck. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as he drove home. Darkness settled across the highway. Headlights stretched through the mist. The radio played quietly, yet the sound remained in his mind. Tick, tick, tick. Hours later, long after sunset, Walter sat alone at his kitchen table. A lamp illuminated stacks of old photographs and railroad manuals he hadn't touched in years. The house was silent. Too silent. He poured himself a cup of coffee he didn't need. Outside, rain struck the windows. Then, without warning, a memory surfaced. Sharp, clear, uninvited. A rail yard. Summer heat. 34 years ago. Another locomotive. Another curve. And another faint metallic rhythm almost nobody else had noticed. Walter slowly lowered the coffee mug. His pulse quickened, because he suddenly remembered where he had heard that sound before. 3 days before a fatal accident. And according to the official investigation, that sound had never existed. Walter barely slept. The memory had arrived with such clarity that it felt less like remembering and more like stepping through a door that had been sealed for decades. At 3 a.m, he sat alone in his kitchen, the glow from a single lamp spreading across old paperwork. Rain continued tapping against the windows while the rest of the neighborhood slept. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. He didn't notice. His attention remained fixed on a faded photograph lying on the table. 6 men standing beside a locomotive. Greasy uniforms, sunburned faces, arms crossed, smiling at the camera. One of them was Walter. Another was Danny Mercer. Walter reached for the photograph and studied the younger version of his friend. Danny had been the kind of man who could fix almost anything. Locomotive engines, broken generators, faulty radios, Even old lawnmowers neighbors dragged into his garage on weekends. People trusted Danny. That was one reason his death had hit so many people so hard. Officially, the accident had been ruled a mechanical failure caused by excessive wear. A tragedy. Nobody's fault. Case closed. Yet Walter had never fully accepted the explanation. Not because he had evidence, because something about it had always felt incomplete. And now, after hearing that strange metallic rhythm again, old doubts were waking up. By sunrise, Walter had made a decision. He needed records. Real records. Not memories, not assumptions. Records. The County Transportation Archive occupied part of an aging municipal building on the edge of town. The place smelled faintly of paper, dust, and old carpet. Rows of filing cabinets stretched beneath fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. A clerk directed Walter toward a section containing railway reports from previous decades. He spent hours searching. Most documents were exactly as he remembered. Inspection logs, maintenance reports, incident summaries, thousands of pages of technical language. Most people would have found it unbearable. Walter felt strangely comfortable. Railroads had always documented everything. The challenge wasn't finding information. The challenge was finding what everyone else overlooked. By early afternoon, he finally located the accident file. The folder was thinner than he expected. Too thin. Walter sat at a long table and slowly reviewed every page. Photographs, witness statements, mechanical assessments, timelines. Nothing immediately stood out. Then he noticed something peculiar. One maintenance report referenced an additional engineering review, but the review itself wasn't attached. Walter checked again. Same result. The report existed. The review didn't. A missing document. Maybe an innocent filing error. Maybe not. He copied the reference number into his notebook, then leaned back in his chair. His neck ached. His eyes felt tired, but for the first time since hearing the sound, he felt movement. A thread. Small, fragile, but real. That evening, his daughter called. Emily rarely phoned unexpectedly. Their relationship had improved over the years, but it still carried old scars. Too many missed birthdays. Too many nights Walter had chosen work over family. Railroads didn't care about holidays. Unfortunately, neither had he. At least not enough. Hey, Dad. Hey. You sound tired. Walter glanced at the papers scattered across his dining table. Been digging through old records. A pause. Train stuff? He laughed quietly. Train stuff. Of course. There was affection in her voice, but also amusement. Walter couldn't blame her. Most people his age spent retirement gardening or traveling. He was investigating a 34-year-old accident. Emily grew serious. Something wrong? Walter hesitated. Then, unexpectedly, told her everything. The locomotive, the sound, the missing report, the memory, the accident. For a while, she simply listened. No interruptions, no judgments. When he finished, silence lingered. Finally, she asked, "Do you think you're right?" Walter stared out the window. The sky beyond the glass had turned dark blue. Streetlights reflected on wet pavement. "I don't know. That's not what I asked." He smiled. Emily had inherited her mother's ability to cut through nonsense. Walter exhaled. Yes. Another pause. Then she said something he didn't expect. "Then let's find out." 2 days later, Walter drove nearly 4 hours to a small coastal town. The highway followed stretches of rugged shoreline where waves crashed against dark rocks below. His destination was a modest white house overlooking the water. Frank Dawson lived there, or at least he used to. Walter hadn't seen him in nearly 20 years. They had worked together during the final years before the accident, back when both men still believed they understood how the world worked. Frank answered the door after the second knock. For a moment, neither spoke. Age had changed them both. Gray hair, slower movements, more lines around the eyes. Then Frank smiled. "Walter Hayes, still alive?" "Barely." The two men laughed. Inside, they spent an hour talking about everything except why Walter had come. Old coworkers, retirement, health problems, grandchildren, the safe topics. Eventually, Frank poured coffee and sat across from him. "You didn't drive 4 hours for nostalgia." Walter nodded. "No." Frank's smile faded. "The Mercer accident." Walter watched his reaction carefully. Frank looked away toward the ocean. and suddenly appeared much older. "You remember that sound?" Walter asked quietly. Frank didn't answer immediately. Outside, gulls circled above the water. The house creaked softly in the coastal wind. Finally, Frank spoke. "I was wondering if you'd ever bring that up." Walter's pulse quickened. "You heard it too." Frank nodded. Slowly. "I did." The admission landed heavily, not because it was surprising, because it confirmed Walter wasn't imagining things. For decades he had wondered. Now he knew. "You never said anything." Frank gave a bitter laugh. "Neither did you." Walter couldn't argue with that. The truth hurt. Both men had seen fragments. Neither had pushed hard enough. Frank stood and walked toward a bookshelf. From a drawer beneath it, he retrieved an old folder. The paper inside had yellowed with age. He handed it to Walter. "What's this?" "I kept copies." Walter opened the folder. His eyes widened. Engineering notes, internal communications, technical observations, documents missing from the official file. Frank sat back down. "A few of us suspected a manufacturing defect." Walter looked up. "A wheel assembly?" Frank nodded. "Small alignment problem." The exact words made Walter's stomach tighten, because they matched the suspicion forming in his own mind. "We couldn't prove it," Frank continued. "The investigation moved fast. The company wanted answers. The lawyers wanted closure. And Danny?" Frank stared into his coffee. "Danny became the explanation." The room fell silent. Walter looked at the ocean beyond the window. Whitecaps rolled beneath gathering clouds. For years he had carried guilt over Danny's death, not because he caused it, because he stopped asking questions. The railroad moved on. Everyone moved on. Except him. Except maybe Frank. "You know what bothers me most?" Frank finally said. Walter shook his head. "We were good at finding problems." His voice grew quieter. "We just weren't very good at fighting people." Neither man spoke after that, because some truths arrived too late to argue with. That night, Walter returned home exhausted, yet his determination felt stronger than it had in years. The pieces were beginning to align, not enough to prove anything, but enough to continue. When he pulled into his driveway, he noticed a text from Emily. Attached was a video file, rail enthusiast footage, recorded near the new freight corridor. Emily had spent the day searching online archives and hobbyist forums. Walter opened the video. Frame by frame, he watched the locomotive enter the curve. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he saw it. A movement so small it was nearly invisible. A subtle oscillation near the wheel assembly. Tiny, precise, wrong. Walter froze the frame. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. The alignment error wasn't imaginary. It was there, hidden in plain sight. And according to the launch schedule he had found earlier that day, the company's largest freight expansion in years would begin in less than 48 hours. For the first time since this began, Walter wasn't chasing a feeling anymore. He was chasing proof. And now he finally had a place to start. The video changed everything. Not because it proved Walter was right. It didn't. Not yet. But after weeks of uncertainty, memories, and old paperwork, it gave him something solid, a flaw that could actually be seen, even if only for a fraction of a second. The next morning, sunlight broke through low clouds as Walter sat at his kitchen table studying the footage again. Frame by frame. Pause, zoom, advance, pause. The tiny oscillation appeared every time the locomotive entered the curve, always in the same place, always under the same conditions, always disappearing before anyone would notice during normal operation. Emily sat beside him with a notebook open. She had taken time off work for the first time in years. The realization still surprised Walter. His daughter wasn't helping because she cared about trains. She was helping because she cared about him. "You've watched it 30 times, she said. 32. She smiled. "Find anything new?" Walter rubbed his eyes. "No." "That's good or bad?" "Good." She raised an eyebrow. "How?" "Because if the evidence changes every time you look at it, it isn't evidence." Emily laughed softly. The sound filled the kitchen. For a moment, Walter found himself remembering her as a little girl sitting at this same table, drawing pictures while he prepared for overnight shifts. Back then, he always assumed there would be more time later, more birthdays, more weekends, more conversations. Life had moved faster than he expected. The thought lingered as he closed the laptop. We need someone willing to listen. Emily nodded. And if they don't? Walter looked toward the window. The answer came without hesitation. Then we keep talking. By noon, they were inside a conference room at North River Rail Operations. The room overlooked the freight yard. Large windows framed rows of locomotives waiting on parallel tracks. Executives, engineers, maintenance supervisors, and safety personnel filled the seats. Some recognized Walter from his years on the railroad. Others saw only an elderly retiree carrying a folder. The atmosphere remained professional, but cautious. Nobody enjoyed unexpected delays, especially not 2 days before a major freight expansion. Walter stood near the front of the room. His hands felt steady, surprisingly steady. He wasn't nervous about speaking. He was nervous about being dismissed. There was a difference. A senior operations manager folded his arms. "You believe there's a safety issue?" Walter nodded. "I believe there's a possibility of one." The manager glanced at the screen displaying the footage. "We've inspected these units. I know. Diagnostics are normal. I know. Then why are we here?" Walter took a breath, because this wasn't really about machines. It was about uncertainty, about convincing people to investigate something that barely existed. "Because diagnostics measure what they're designed to measure," Walter said. "They don't always measure what nobody thought to look for." The room remained quiet, not convinced, but listening. Walter continued. He explained the historical accident, the archived records, the missing review, Frank's documentation, the repeated oscillation, the wheel assembly concerns. He didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize, simply presented facts. When he finished, the room sat in thoughtful silence. Finally, a younger engineer spoke. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" Walter answered immediately. "Run a targeted stress test." The operations manager frowned. "That would delay the launch." "Possibly. Do you understand how expensive that could be?" Walter met his eyes. "Do you understand how expensive it could be if I'm right?" Nobody spoke after that. Not because the question was dramatic, because it was reasonable, and reasonable questions are often the hardest to dismiss. The testing began before sunrise the following morning. A cold mist hung across the rail yard. Portable monitoring equipment lined the track. Engineers moved between stations carrying tablets and instruments. The locomotive sat waiting beneath floodlights. NRX 7148, the same machine Walter had noticed days earlier. Standing beside the rails, he felt strangely detached. For weeks he had pursued this mystery with relentless focus. Now it belonged to others, to specialists, to data, to evidence, exactly where it should belong. Emily stood nearby with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him. "You okay?" Walter nodded. "I think so. You don't sound convincing." He smiled faintly. "Just tired." The truth ran deeper. He was realizing that this investigation had never been solely about the present. Part of him had been chasing something from 34 years ago, something unfinished, something painful. The testing sequence began. The locomotive accelerated, entered the curve. Monitoring systems recorded every movement, every vibration, every force, again and again and again. Hours passed. Data accumulated. Engineers reviewed results, adjusted equipment, repeated procedures. Nobody rushed. Nobody guessed. The process was methodical, professional, the way safety investigations should be. By late afternoon, a small group gathered around a monitor. Expressions changed. Conversations grew quieter, more focused. Walter noticed it immediately. Engineers had a particular look when they encountered something unexpected. Not panic, concentration. The operations manager approached him. This time his posture felt different, less defensive, more respectful. "We found it." Walter didn't answer. The manager continued. Alignment variation inside the wheel assembly. A slow breath escaped Walter's chest. Not relief. Not yet. The manager pointed toward a chart. "Under normal conditions, it's harmless." Walter remained silent. Both men already knew there was a but coming. The manager nodded toward the screen. "Under repeated high-load stress, it creates cumulative fatigue." There it was, the missing piece. The thing hidden beneath inspections, diagnostics, and assumptions. Tiny, almost insignificant, until time amplified it. "How long?" Walter asked. The manager glanced toward another engineer. "Months, maybe." "Then?" The engineer answered. "Potential component failure." Nobody needed further explanation. Railroads operate on margins. Small errors become large consequences. Not immediately, gradually, quietly. The dangerous problems were often the patient ones. Walter looked out across the yard. Freight trains stretched toward the horizon. Steel rails reflected the fading sunlight. The world appeared exactly the same, yet something fundamental had changed. A disaster had likely been prevented. Not dramatically, not publicly, simply through attention. The launch was postponed. Additional inspections were ordered. Replacement components were installed across multiple units. The story never reached national news. Most people never heard about it, and that was perfectly fine. Months later, spring arrived. Fresh green leaves covered trees along the river valley. The air carried the scent of rain and new growth. On a Saturday morning, Walter and Emily visited the Regional Railway Museum. Families wandered through restored passenger cars. Children climbed into old cabooses. Volunteers shared stories about rail history. The place felt alive, not with nostalgia, with continuity, past and present existing together. As they moved through one exhibit hall, Walter noticed a recently added display about modern rail safety improvements. Photographs, technical diagrams, historical timelines. Near the bottom sat a small acknowledgement plaque, barely noticeable. Most visitors walked past without slowing down. Walter read it anyway. His name appeared once. Simple, unremarkable. No large headline, no ceremony, no special recognition. Just a brief note acknowledging the engineers and consultants involved in identifying a safety concern. Emily looked at him. How does it feel? Walter considered the question. Years ago, he might have wanted more. Credit, recognition, validation. Now those things seemed surprisingly small. What mattered wasn't the plaque. What mattered was the train still running safely because someone paid attention. It feels finished, he said. Emily smiled, and somehow that answer felt exactly right. Outside, they walked toward the parking lot as a freight train rolled through the valley beyond the museum grounds. The sound drifted across the afternoon air. Steel on steel, rhythmic, steady, healthy. Walter stopped for a moment and listened. For decades, he had spent his life searching for problems, listening for mistakes hidden inside ordinary noise. Today, for the first time he could remember, he wasn't analyzing anything. He wasn't hunting for flaws. He wasn't waiting for danger. He simply listened. The train continued westward, disappearing beyond a curve lined with trees. Walter watched until it vanished from sight. Then he turned and continued walking beside his daughter. Not ahead of her, not behind her, beside her. And as the sound of the train faded into the distance, so did a burden he had carried for more than 30 years. The tracks would continue without him now. And somehow, that felt like peace. Chapter 4. The Things We Leave Behind. 6 months later, Walter Hayes found himself back at North River Freight Terminal. Not because anyone had called him, not because there was another problem, and not because he missed the railroad as much as he once thought. He was there because retirement had finally become something other than waiting. The terminal looked different in early summer. The harsh gray skies of autumn had been replaced by bright sunlight that reflected from rails and steel containers. Grass had pushed through cracks along service roads. Birds perched on signal towers as if they owned the place. The railroad continued its work. Freight trains arrived, freight trains departed. Schedules moved forward. The world never stopped. Walter had learned to appreciate that. He parked near the administration building and stepped out of his truck. Warm air carried the familiar scent of diesel and hot metal. For years, those smells had represented responsibility. Now they felt like memories. A young employee met him near the entrance. "Mr. Hayes?" Walter nodded. The young man smiled. "They're setting up inside." Walter followed him toward one of the training facilities overlooking the yard. Large windows faced multiple tracks. Rows of chairs had been arranged inside. A projector screen stood near the front. About 30 maintenance apprentices filled the room. Most were in their 20s. A few looked even younger. The sight made Walter feel older than he cared to admit. The operations manager approached and shook his hand. "Glad you came." Walter shrugged. "You asked." The manager smiled. "We figured the new hires could learn something." Walter glanced around. "From me?" "From experience." Walter wasn't entirely convinced there was a difference. Still, he took a seat near the front while the room settled. Outside the windows, a freight train rolled past at moderate speed. The vibration hummed faintly through the building. The apprentices barely noticed. Walter did. Some habits never disappeared. When the introduction ended, the operations manager stepped aside. The room turned toward Walter. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Walter looked at the young faces staring back. He had spent most of his life operating locomotives, not giving speeches. The silence stretched. A few apprentices exchanged curious glances. Finally, Walter cleared his throat. "I'm probably the wrong person for this." Several people laughed. "Good. That made things easier." He leaned against the front desk. "They asked me to talk about safety." He paused. "Truth is, most safety lessons aren't very interesting." More laughter. "But the dangerous thing about railroads is that the interesting problems usually aren't the ones that hurt people." The room grew quieter. Walter continued. He spoke about routine, about repetition, about complacency, about learning the difference between noise and information. Not in dramatic terms, in practical ones. He described winter mornings when frozen switches caused delays, tiny vibrations that signaled bearing problems, changes in sound that suggested worn components. The apprentices listened carefully, not because the stories were exciting, because they were real. At one point, a young woman raised her hand. "How did you know something was wrong with that locomotive?" Walter considered the question. The newspapers had simplified the story. Most people assumed he possessed some extraordinary ability. He didn't. "I didn't know." The room looked surprised. "I suspected." "What's the difference?" she asked. "One keeps you curious." The answer lingered. Outside, another freight train moved through the yard. Sunlight flashed across its windows. Walter watched it for a moment before continuing. "The most dangerous words in maintenance aren't 'something's broken.'" He paused. "They're 'it's probably fine.'" Nobody wrote that down. They didn't need to. The expression on several faces told him they would remember it. After the session ended, apprentices gathered around asking questions. Some wanted technical advice. Others wanted stories about older locomotives. One young mechanic stayed behind after everyone else left. Walter recognized him immediately. The same mechanic he had spoken to months earlier, the one carrying the tablet, the one who had politely dismissed his concerns. The young man looked slightly embarrassed. "I owe you an apology." Walter laughed. "No, you don't." "I kind of do. You were doing your job." The mechanic shook his head. "I still should have listened better." Walter studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Now you will." The mechanic returned the smile. And that was the end of it. No resentment, no lecture. Just understanding. The kind earned through experience. That evening, Walter drove toward the edge of town. Instead of heading home immediately, he followed a narrow road that climbed a ridge overlooking the valley. Few people came there anymore. The old observation point had largely been forgotten. A weathered wooden fence stood beside a grassy overlook. Walter parked and walked the remaining distance. The sun hung low above the horizon. Long shadows stretched across fields below. Far in the distance, railroad tracks curved through the valley like silver thread. He leaned against the fence, waited, listened. Several minutes later, a freight train appeared from the eastern hills. Its locomotives glowed gold beneath the setting sun. The train moved steadily westward, unhurried, purposeful, a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. Walter watched until it passed beneath the ridge. Then another memory surfaced. Not of the accident, not of investigations, not of mistakes. Danny Mercer, laughing beside a locomotive, coffee in one hand, grease on his shirt, complaining about management, telling bad jokes, being alive. The memory surprised him. For years, Danny's death had overshadowed everything else. Now the memory felt different, lighter. The loss remained, but it no longer defined the man. Walter smiled. The train's horn echoed across the valley, a long, low note carried by warm evening air. The sound faded slowly, then disappeared. Walter remained at the overlook for a while longer, watching the tracks, watching the sunlight, watching the world continue. Eventually he turned toward his truck. The valley below grew darker as evening arrived. Lights appeared one by one along distant roads. Somewhere beyond the hills, freight trains continued moving through the night. They always would. And for the first time in many years, Walter felt completely comfortable not being aboard any of them. He had spent a lifetime listening to railroads. Now finally, he understood something they had been teaching him all along. The purpose of experience wasn't to hold on forever. It was to leave something useful behind, then trust others to carry it forward.